Hi, I'm Sophia. For 32 years, my family treated me like the black sheep who could never measure up to my golden boy brother. At his wedding in front of 200 guests, my father stood up during the toasts and called me the family. Disappointment. But then my husband walked through those chapel doors, and everything my family thought they knew about success, worth, and who deserved respect got turned upside down in the most spectacular way possible. What happened next didn't just silence the room, it shattered every assumption they'd made about my life for the past decade. Would you have stayed quiet? Or would you have let them discover the truth they never bothered to ask about? Before. We jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was supposed to be the perfect spring wedding. My brother Marcus had spared no expense for his big day at the Rosewood Manor in Charleston. You know, one of those sprawling plantation-style venues with white columns and Spanish moss dripping from ancient oak trees. The kind of place that screams old money and tradition, which was exactly the image my family loved to project, even though we were definitely more middle-class suburban than Southern aristocracy. I had flown in from Seattle 3 days early to help with the final preparations, just like the dutiful sister I'd always been. My parents, Robert and Patricia Blackwell, had made it crystal clear that this wedding was Marcus's moment to shine, and everyone, especially me, needed to play their supporting role perfectly. "Just don't draw attention to yourself, Sophia," my mother had whispered to me while we arranged centerpieces the night before. "This weekend is about Marcus and his future. His future. Always his future. Never mine." Marcus was marrying Isabella Cumberland, a Charleston socialite whose family owned a chain of luxury boutique hotels across the Southeast. It was a match that made my parents practically glow with pride. Their son was marrying up, securing connections, building the kind of life they'd always dreamed of. Meanwhile, I was the daughter who'd moved across the country for what they called that computer job, living in a city they'd never bothered to visit, married to a man they'd met exactly twice in 4 years. "At least Sophia finally found someone willing to put up with her," I'd overheard my father tell Marcus's groomsmen during the rehearsal dinner. The men had chuckled, and Marcus, my own brother, hadn't said a word in my defense. That comment stung, but it wasn't new. I'd grown used to being the punchline, the cautionary tale, the daughter who never quite lived up to expectations. You see, in my family's eyes, I'd made all the wrong choices. While Marcus had gotten his MBA from Duke and landed a prestigious job at a financial consulting firm in Charlotte, I'd studied computer science, moved to the tech capital of the world, and married someone they considered unconventional. My husband Alexander was quiet, reserved, and didn't fit their image of what a successful son-in-law should look like. He wore simple clothes, drove a modest car when he visited, and never talked about his work in detail. To them, he was just another tech worker in a city full of them. "I don't understand why Sophia settled," my mother would say, not even trying to lower her voice. "She could have found someone more substantial, someone with real prospects." What they didn't know, what I'd chosen not to tell them, would have blown their minds. But I'd learned long ago that my family was more interested in appearances than truth, more invested in what looked impressive than what actually mattered. They wanted Marcus to marry the socialite, live in the big house, join the country club. My path had never fit their narrative, so they'd simply decided it wasn't worth their attention. The morning of the wedding, I stood in the bridal suite helping Isabella with her dress, listening to my mother gush about how perfect everything was, how this was exactly the kind of wedding she'd always dreamed of for her children. The unspoken message was clear. This was the wedding I should have had, if only I'd made better choices. "Your brother is so lucky," Isabella said, adjusting her veil in the mirror. "To have such a supportive family, such clear direction for his future. It must be nice to always know you're on the right path." I smiled and nodded, fastening the last button on her gown. Marcus has always been good at knowing what people expect from him. What I didn't say was that I'd stopped trying to meet those expectations years ago. What I didn't mention was that while they were all focused on Marcus's impressive job and his socially connected bride, I'd built something they couldn't even comprehend. But today wasn't about me. It never was. So I kept my mouth shut and played my role. The ceremony was beautiful, I'll give them that. Marcus looked handsome in his custom tuxedo. Isabella was radiant in her designer gown, and my parents beamed with pride as they watched their golden child marry into Charleston society. I sat in the third row, not the first, because that was reserved for immediate family who really mattered, according to the seating chart my mother had agonized over for weeks. During the reception, I watched my family work the room like seasoned politicians. My father, a small-town insurance broker who'd built a decent business, transformed into this gregarious host, telling everyone about Marcus's promotion, his new house, his bright future. My mother floated between tables in her mother of the groom dress, accepting compliments about her successful son and his perfect match. And then came the toasts. Marcus's best man spoke about friendship and loyalty. Isabella's maid of honor talked about love and dreams coming true. Several family friends shared sweet stories about watching Marcus grow up. Then my father stood up, champagne glass in hand. And I knew from the look in his eyes that this wasn't going to be just another standard wedding toast. Little did anyone know that in about 30 minutes, my husband would be walking through those doors, and every single assumption they'd made about success, worth, and who deserved respect in our family was about to be completely shattered. But first, I had to sit through what would become the most humiliating moment of my adult life. And somehow, the beginning of the most satisfying vindication I'd ever experienced. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My father cleared his throat and tapped his champagne flute with his wedding ring, the familiar sound cutting through the gentle chatter of 200 guests. The reception hall at Rosewood Manor fell quiet, Spanish moss swaying gently outside the floor-to-ceiling windows as everyone turned their attention to the man who'd raised two very different children. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying that practiced confidence he used when addressing his insurance clients. "As the father of the groom, I wanted to take a moment to talk about success, about family, and about the choices that define us." I should have known from those opening words that this wasn't going to be a typical father of the groom toast. There was something in his tone, a weight that made my stomach tighten. I glanced around the table at Isabella's family. Her father, a hotel magnate worth hundreds of millions, her mother dripping in pearls and understated elegance, her siblings who'd all graduated from Ivy League schools and married within their social circle. "Marcus has always been the son who made us proud," my father continued, his chest swelling as he looked at my brother. "From his academic achievements to his career success, from his choice of friends to his choice of bride, everything he's done has brought honor to the Blackwell name," the guests murmured approvingly. Marcus beamed, raising his own glass slightly, in acknowledgement. Isabella squeezed his hand, her engagement ring, a 5-carat diamond that had cost more than most people's cars, catching the light from the crystal chandeliers. "Success isn't just about what you achieve," my father went on, his voice gaining momentum. "It's about the values you uphold, the relationships you build, the way you represent your family in the world." That's when his eyes found mine across the crowded reception hall. Something shifted in his expression, and I felt that familiar chill I'd experienced countless times growing up. The moment when I was about to become the cautionary tale, the negative example used to highlight someone else's virtue. "In every family, you have children who understand these principles," he said, his gaze never leaving my face. "And then you have children who choose different paths." The room was perfectly still now. I could hear my own heartbeat. over the soft classical music playing in the background. Several guests had turned to look at me, clearly sensing that this toast was taking an unexpected turn. Sophia has always marched to the beat of her own drum, my father continued, and the way he said it made it sound like a character flaw rather than an admirable trait. Moving across the country, pursuing interests we don't quite understand, making choices that... He paused, as if searching for the right words. Well, choices that haven't exactly aligned with what we hoped for her. My mother's face had gone pale. Even she seemed surprised by the direction this was heading. Marcus looked uncomfortable for the first time all evening, shifting in his seat as he realized what was happening. While Marcus was building his career and finding a partner who complements his ambitions, my father pressed on. Sophia has been content to settle, to choose the easier path, to be, frankly, the family disappointment. The words hit me like a physical blow. The family disappointment. At my brother's wedding, in front of 200 people, including some of the most influential families in Charleston. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Isabella's grandmother actually clutched her pearls. I felt my face burning with humiliation as conversations stopped at tables throughout the hall. Even the waitstaff had frozen in place, unsure whether to continue serving or pretend they hadn't. Heard? But that's what makes Marcus's success even more remarkable, my father concluded, raising his glass higher. He could have taken the easy road, could have given up on excellence, could have settled for mediocrity like some people do. Instead, he chose to be exceptional. He chose to make us proud. So here's to Marcus and Isabella, to real success, real love, and real commitment to family values. The crowd's response was muted, confused. Some people raised their glasses half-heartedly. Others looked around awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with what they'd just witnessed. Several of Isabella's relatives were whispering behind their hands, shooting glances in my direction. I sat frozen in my chair, the word disappointment echoing in my mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. My hands were shaking as I reached for my water glass, trying to process what had just happened. My own father had just publicly humiliated me at my brother's wedding, used me as a foil to highlight Marcus's supposed superiority, reduced my entire life to a cautionary tale about settling and mediocrity. Marcus was looking at me now, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and something that might have been guilt. But he didn't stand up. He didn't correct our father. He didn't defend me. He just sat there, accepting the praise that had been built on my public humiliation. Sophia, my mother whispered urgently, leaning across the table. Just don't make a scene. Please. This is Marcus's day. Don't make a scene. Even now, even after what had just happened, the concern was about appearances, about not disrupting Marcus's perfect moment. Never mind that my father had just announced to Charleston's social elite that I was a disappointment to my family. Never mind that he'd reduced my marriage, my career, my entire life to a failure story. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady. I needed air. I needed space. I needed to get away from the stares and whispers that were already starting to spread through the reception hall like wildfire. "Where are you going?" my mother hissed. "Outside," I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange and distant to my own ears. As I walked toward the French doors that led to the manor's gardens, I could hear the conversations resuming behind me, the buzz of voices that I knew were discussing what they'd just witnessed. The Blackwell family drama was now the evening's entertainment. I stepped onto the stone terrace overlooking the manicured gardens, the warm Charleston evening air hitting my face like a gentle slap back to reality. The sun was setting behind the oak trees, casting long shadows across the lawn where tomorrow morning the grounds crew would clean up the remnants of my brother's perfect wedding. That's when I heard the sound of gravel crunching in the circular driveway. A car was approaching, probably late guests or vendors. I didn't turn around. I couldn't face going back inside yet, couldn't stomach the thought of more pitying looks or whispered conversations about the family disappointment. But then I heard footsteps on the stone pathway behind me, measured and familiar, and for the first time since my father's toast, I felt something other than humiliation. I felt hope, because I recognized that walk, and I knew that everything was about to change. I turned around slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs, and there he was. Alexander stood at the edge of the terrace in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit I'd never seen before, his usually tousled hair styled immaculately, and something in his posture that seemed different, more commanding, more certain. Behind him, partially visible in the circular driveway, was a sleek black Bentley Continental that definitely hadn't been there when the reception started. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said quietly, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that had always made me feel safe. My flight was delayed, and then there was some confusion with the driver. Flight? Driver? Alexander had told me he couldn't make it to the wedding because of a work commitment he couldn't reschedule. We'd had a small argument about it 3 weeks ago. Well, as close to an argument as we ever got. I'd been disappointed, maybe even a little hurt, that he'd chosen work over being there for one of the most important family events of the year. "You came," I whispered, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes. After what had just happened inside, seeing him here felt like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning. "Of course I came," he said, stepping closer. "Did you really think I'd let you face your family alone? Especially today?" There was something in his tone, something that suggested he knew more about what had been happening than he should have. But before I could ask, he gently took my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears I didn't even realize had started falling. "What happened in there?" he asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected. "My father," I began, then stopped. "How do you explain to your husband that your own father just publicly declared you a disappointment in front of 200 people? How do you admit that your family had used your wedding day, well, your brother's wedding day, to announce to Charleston society that you were the failure of the family?" "He called me the family disappointment," I finally managed to say. In his toast, in front of everyone, he said I settled, that I chose the easy path, that I've been a disappointment compared to Marcus, who made them proud by marrying into the right family and having the right career and making all the right choices. Alexander's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I saw something flash in his eyes that I'd rarely seen before. Anger. Real, cold anger. "And Marcus?" he asked quietly. Said nothing. Did nothing. Just sat there and accepted the praise while our father used me as the cautionary tale. The words came out bitter, more bitter than I'd intended, but I was past caring about hiding my hurt. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, looking past me toward the French doors where the reception was still ongoing. I could hear laughter and music drifting out, the sounds of celebration continuing as if nothing had happened, as if my public humiliation was just a minor interruption in the evening's festivities. "Sophia," he said finally, his voice careful and measured in a way that made me pay attention. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago, but I wanted you to love me for who I am, not for what I have." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. "What do you mean?" He took a step back, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, and suddenly I noticed details I'd missed before. The suit wasn't just well-tailored. It was bespoke, the kind that cost more than most people's monthly salary. His watch, which I'd always assumed was a nice but modest timepiece, caught the light from the manor's exterior lamps, and I realized it was a Patek Philippe. The shoes were handmade Italian leather. Even his cufflinks looked like they cost more than my car payment. "Alexander?" I prompted, my voice barely above a whisper. "My work," he began, then stopped. "The reason I'm always traveling, the reason I sometimes disappear for days at a time, The reason I couldn't talk about my projects in detail when your family asked. My stomach dropped. Was he about to tell me he was having an affair? That our marriage was a lie? That on top of everything else that had gone wrong tonight, I was about to lose the one person who actually cared about me? I didn't want to tell you like this, he continued. I had plans, better plans, but after what just happened in there, after hearing how your family treats you, he shook his head. They need to know who you really are. Who we really are. Alexander, you're scaring me. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, not the modest smartphone I was used to seeing him with, but a device I didn't recognize, sleek and expensive looking. He showed me the screen, and I found myself staring at what appeared to be a financial portfolio dashboard with numbers that made no sense. My name isn't just Alexander Thorne, he said quietly. It's Alexander James Thorne III. And those work. Trips I take? Those tech projects I can never discuss? I'm not just another software engineer in Seattle, Sophia. I'm the founder and CEO of Thorne Industries. We develop AI systems for Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, and international corporations. The company is valued at just over $12 billion. The world seemed to tilt sideways. I gripped the stone balustrade to steady myself, certain I'd misheard him. 12. What? Billion. With a B. His voice was gentle, patient, as if he was explaining something complex to a child. I started the company when I was 22, with a loan from my grandfather's estate. We went public 3 years ago. I've been on the Forbes list for the past 2 years, though I try to keep a low profile. I stared at him, this man I'd been married to for 4 years, this man I'd shared a bed with, made breakfast for, argued with about whose turn it was to take out the trash. The man my family had dismissed as another forgettable tech worker who wasn't good enough for their daughter. But you drive a Honda, I said stupidly, as if that somehow proved he couldn't be telling the truth. In Seattle, yes, I own 12 cars, but I prefer to keep things simple when I'm home. The house we live in? I own the entire block. I just wanted to give you a normal life, a real relationship not based on money or status or what I could provide for you financially. My legs felt weak. I sank down onto the stone bench beside the balustrade, trying to process what he was telling me. $12 billion. Give or take a few $100 million depending on the market. He sat down beside me, taking my hand in his. Sophia, I've watched your family dismiss you for 4 years. I've listened to them make snide comments about your choices, about settling for less, about how you could have done better. And the whole time, I've wanted to tell them exactly how wrong they are. Why didn't you? The question came out sharper than I intended, but I was feeling overwhelmed, confused, almost betrayed. Why let them think? Why let me think? Because I needed to know that you loved me for me, he said simply. Not for the money, not for the lifestyle, not for what dating a billionaire could do for your social status. I needed to know that when you said yes to marrying me, you were saying yes to the person, not the bank account. I thought about our dating years, our simple dinners at neighborhood restaurants, our quiet evenings at home, our modest wedding ceremony in Seattle with just a few close friends. I thought about how he'd never made me feel like I needed to be anything other than myself, never pressured me to change or conform or live up to some impossible standard. The work trips? I asked. Board meetings, investor calls, international expansion projects. I have offices in 15 countries, Sophia. I employ over 40,000 people. He squeezed my hand gently. I hated lying to you, but I also loved having a wife who greeted me at the door because she missed me, not because she wanted to know how much money I'd made that day. Through the French doors, I could see the reception continuing, my family and the Charleston elite celebrating Marcus and Isabella's union, probably still gossiping about the family disappointment who'd been publicly humiliated and then disappeared, onto the terrace. "They have no idea," I said slowly. "None whatsoever. And honestly, after what your father just did in there, after listening to 4 years of comments about how I'm not successful enough, not ambitious enough, not good enough for their daughter," Alexander's voice hardened slightly, "I think it's time they learned the truth." I looked at my husband, really looked at him, and suddenly saw details I'd been blind to for years. The quiet confidence that I'd always attributed to his personality. The way he never seemed stressed about money, never worried about bills or expenses. The mysterious phone calls he'd take in other rooms. The way he'd sometimes disappear for days and come back exhausted but satisfied, like someone who'd just closed a major deal. $12 billion, I repeated, the number still not quite sinking in. "And growing," he said with a small smile. "We're about to announce a partnership with 3 major automotive companies for our autonomous vehicle AI. Should bump us up another few billion by the end of the year." Inside the manor, I could hear my father's voice rising above the conversation, probably holding court with Isabella's family, basking in the glow of Marcus's successful marriage. The man who just called me a disappointment had no idea that his despised son-in-law was worth more than everyone in that room combined. "What do we do now?" I asked. Alexander stood up and offered me his hand, his smile widening. "Now, Mrs. Thorne, we go back inside and let your family meet the real Alexander. Unless you'd prefer to keep this our secret?" I thought about my father's words, about the humiliation, about a lifetime of being treated like the lesser child, the disappointment, the one who'd settled for less. I took his hand and stood up. "Let's go show them what settling really looks like." As we walked back toward the French doors, my mind raced through 4 years of memories that suddenly looked completely different. I thought about our first date at that little Italian restaurant in Capitol Hill, how Alexander had insisted on paying but hadn't made a big show of it. I'd assumed he was just being polite, maybe trying to impress me with his modest tech salary. Now I realized he probably could have bought the entire restaurant without checking his bank balance. I remembered our apartment hunting in Seattle, how he'd casually suggested we look at places in Madison Park and Queen Anne, neighborhoods I'd thought were way above our budget. When I'd expressed concern about the rent, he'd simply said his work was doing well and we could afford it. I'd been so grateful to have a partner who was financially stable enough to split a nice one-bedroom. The idea that he owned the entire block hadn't even occurred to me as a possibility. But it wasn't just the money that was recontextualizing everything. It was the pattern of how my family had treated both of us over the years. Every holiday visit to Charlotte, every family gathering, every phone call where my parents had made their disappointment crystal clear. I thought about Christmas 2 years ago, when my mother had cornered me in the kitchen while I was helping with dinner preparations. "Sophia, honey," she'd said in that tone that always preceded unwanted advice, "don't you think it's time you and Alexander started thinking about your future more seriously? Marcus just got promoted again, and he's already talking about buying a house in Myers Park. What are Alexander's plans for advancement?" I'd tried to explain that Alexander was doing well, that he was working on important projects, but I'd sounded vague even to myself because I genuinely didn't know the details. My mother had just sighed and patted my shoulder like I was a child, who didn't understand how the adult world worked. "I just want you to be secure," she'd continued. "Your father and I worry that you're not thinking long-term. What happens when you want to start a family? Can Alexander provide the kind of stability Marcus can offer? The kind of stability Marcus could offer. Marcus, who worked for a consulting firm and made decent money but still needed my parents' help with his down payment. Marcus, who drove a leased BMW and lived in a nice but modest townhouse in Charlotte's suburbs. Marcus, whose greatest achievement in my parents' eyes was landing Isabella, not because he loved her, but because she represented the social mobility they'd always craved. Then there was last Thanksgiving, when my father had pulled Alexander aside after dinner. I'd been in the living room with my mother and Marcus, but I could hear their conversation through the kitchen doorway. "So, Alexander," my father had said in his man-to-man voice, "Sophia tells us you're in computers. That's a young man's game, isn't it? What's your plan for when the technology moves on without you?" Alexander's response had been polite but non-committal, something about adapting to change and continuing to learn. My father had pressed on. "The thing is, son, I've been in business for 30 years. I know what real success looks like. It's about building something lasting, something that provides security for your family. These tech jobs, they come and go. One day you're hot, the next day you're obsolete." I'd cringed, embarrassed by my father's condescending tone, but Alexander had just listened patiently. Now I wondered what had been going through his mind. Here was a man worth billions being lectured about business success by someone who sold insurance policies in a small southern city. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Blackwell," Alexander had replied. "I love your daughter, and I'm committed to building a life with her that makes her happy." "Love doesn't pay the bills," my father had said with a chuckle that wasn't entirely kind. "I hope you're thinking practically about Sophia's future. She deserves better than scraping by." Scraping by. My father had genuinely believed that Alexander and I were struggling financially, probably living paycheck to paycheck like so many young couples. The irony was staggering. But the worst memory, the one that really showed me how deep my family's dismissal went, had happened just 6 months ago. Marcus had announced his engagement to Isabella, and my parents had immediately started planning an engagement party. During one of our regular Sunday phone calls, my mother had mentioned the guest list. "We're inviting the Hendersons, the Walkers, all of your father's business associates," she'd said excitedly. "Isabella's family, of course. The mayor might even come. You know how connected the Cumberlands are." "That sounds lovely," I'd said, genuinely happy for Marcus despite everything. "We thought about having you and Alexander come," my mother had continued. "But honestly, sweetheart, I'm not sure you'd fit in with that crowd. These are very successful people, very accomplished. I wouldn't want you to feel out of place." Out of place. My own brother's engagement party, and I wouldn't fit in because my husband wasn't successful enough, wasn't accomplished enough, wasn't the right kind of person to mingle with Charleston's social elite. I'd hung up that call feeling hollow, diminished. Alexander had found me crying in our kitchen in the house he owned outright, I now realized. And when I'd explained what happened, he'd held me while I sobbed about feeling like a failure in my own family. "You're not a failure," he'd whispered into my hair. "You're the most accomplished person I know. You're brilliant, you're kind, you work harder than anyone I've ever met. If they can't see that, it's their loss." But even as he'd comforted me, I'd wondered if maybe my parents were right. Maybe I had settled. Maybe I'd chosen the easy path by marrying someone safe and comfortable instead of someone who could elevate my status. Maybe I was the disappointment. They thought I was. Now, standing outside the reception hall where my father had just publicly declared me a failure, I understood how thoroughly I'd been gaslit by my own family. They'd convinced me that my choices were wrong, that my marriage was settling, that my life was somehow less valuable than Marcus's because it didn't look like what they thought success should be. The truth was that while they'd been obsessing over appearances and social climbing, I'd unknowingly married one of the most successful entrepreneurs of our generation. While they'd been lecturing Alexander about building something lasting, he'd been running a company that employed 40,000 people and generated billions in revenue. While they'd worried about my financial security, I'd been living a life of complete financial freedom without even knowing it. But perhaps most importantly, while they'd been judging our relationship based on superficial markers of success, Alexander and I had built something real. He'd chosen to keep his wealth secret not because he was ashamed of it, but because he wanted our love to be genuine. He'd let my family dismiss him because he valued our authentic connection more than their approval. I thought about all the times I'd apologized to Alexander for my family's behavior, all the times I'd made excuses for their rudeness or explained away their condescension. I'd been embarrassed by them without fully realizing why, instinctively knowing that something was wrong with how they treated the man I loved. "You've been protecting me," I said suddenly, stopping just before we reached the French doors. Alexander turned to look at me, eyebrows raised in question. "All these years, you've been letting them insult you, dismiss you, treat you like you weren't good enough. You could have shut them down at any time, could have made them feel as small as they tried to make you feel, but you didn't. You protected me from having to deal with the aftermath of that kind of confrontation." His expression softened. "I didn't want to be the reason you lost your family, even if they didn't deserve you. They lost me the moment my father called me a disappointment in front of 200 people," I said firmly. "And you know what? Maybe that's exactly what needed to happen for me to see them clearly." Through the glass doors, I could see the reception in full swing. Marcus and Isabella were on the dance floor, lost in their perfect moment. My parents were at the head table, my father still holding court with Isabella's relatives, probably basking in the social connections this marriage would bring him. They had no idea that in about 30 seconds, every assumption they'd made about success, about worth, about who belonged in their social circle, was about to be completely destroyed. "Are you ready for this?" Alexander asked, straightening his tie. His very expensive tie, I now noticed. I looked at my husband, this man who'd loved me quietly and completely for 4 years, who'd built an empire while making me feel like the most important thing in his world, who'd endured years of subtle insults and condescension because he valued our relationship more than his ego. "I've been ready my whole life," I said. "I just didn't know it." Together, we walked back into the reception hall, and I felt the shift in energy immediately. This time, I wasn't the family disappointment slinking back with her tail between her legs. This time, I was Alexander Thorne's wife, and whether my family knew it or not yet, that changed everything. The moment we stepped back into the reception hall, conversations began to shift. It started subtly, a few heads turning, whispers, behind champagne flutes, curious glances at Alexander's impeccable appearance. But then, Isabella's uncle, Richard Cumberland, who owned a chain of luxury hotels across 3 states and had the kind of business connections that made my father practically salivate, looked up from his conversation and did a double-take. "I'm sorry," Richard said, approaching us with the confidence of a man who was used to recognizing important people. "You look incredibly familiar. Have we met?" Alexander extended his hand with a smile that was polite but measured. "Alexander Thorne. I don't believe we've been formally introduced." The effect was immediate and electric. Richard's eyes widened, and he gripped Alexander's hand like he was meeting a celebrity. "Alexander Thorne, of Thorne Industries. My God. I read about your autonomous vehicle partnership in the Wall Street Journal just last week. That was you?" "Guilty as charged," Alexander replied with the kind of understated confidence that comes from genuine achievement rather than pretension. The conversation around us began to quiet as other guests started to pay attention. Isabella's father, William Cumberland, who had been deep in discussion with my own father about real estate investments, suddenly looked over with sharp interest. "Did someone say Thorne Industries?" William asked, walking over with the kind of urgency that successful businessmen reserve for potentially lucrative connections. "Alexander Thorne? The AI pioneer?" "That's right," Alexander confirmed, and I watched as my father's expression shifted from mild curiosity to confusion to something approaching alarm. William Cumberland was practically vibrating with excitement. "I've been following your company for months. Your stock performance has been extraordinary. The automotive partnership announcement sent ripples through every major investment firm in the country. We're pleased with the market response," Alexander said diplomatically. "Market response?" Richard laughed, pulling out his phone. "William, show him the Forbes article from last month, the one that listed him as one of the top 10 most influential tech CEOs under 40. As William scrolled through his phone, I could see my father approaching our group, his face a mask of confusion and growing concern. Behind him, my mother was craning her neck to see what was causing the commotion, while Marcus and Isabella had stopped dancing to observe the gathering crowd around my husband. "Here it is," William announced, holding up his phone screen. Forbes, The Quiet Billionaire, How Alexander Thorne Built an AI Empire While Staying Under the Radar. My investment advisor has been recommending your stock for 6 months. The word billionaire hung in the air like a bomb that had just been dropped. I watched my father's face drain of color as the implications began to sink in. Around us, more guests were gravitating toward our conversation, drawn by the excitement in the Cumberland family's voices. Billionaire? My mother's voice cut through the murmur of conversations as she appeared at my father's elbow, her eyes darting between Alexander and me with barely concealed panic. Multi-billionaire, actually, corrected Margaret Cumberland, Isabella's aunt, who had been quietly Googling on her own phone. According to this Bloomberg article, Thorne Industries is valued at over $12 billion, and he owns a controlling stake. The reception hall had gone remarkably quiet. Even the band seemed to sense that something significant was happening and had lowered the volume of their music. Isabella and Marcus were now standing just a few feet away, both looking like they'd been hit by a truck. "I don't understand," my father said weakly, looking directly at Alexander with an expression I'd never seen before, complete bewilderment mixed with dawning horror. "You're in computers. You work in Seattle. You drive a Honda." Alexander's smile was patient, but had developed an edge that I recognized from his business calls. The polite but unmistakable authority of someone who was used to being the most important person in the room. "I am in computers, in a manner of speaking," Alexander replied. "I develop AI systems that revolutionize how Fortune 500 companies operate. I do work in Seattle, when I'm not traveling to our offices in London, Tokyo, Singapore, or Frankfurt. And yes, I do drive a Honda in Seattle. I find it's better for the environment than taking one of the other cars." "Other cars?" Isabella asked faintly. "I collect vintage Porsches," Alexander said casually, as if he were discussing the weather. "Though my daily driver in most cities is usually something more practical." Richard Cumberland let out a low whistle. "I read about your car collection in Rob Report. Didn't you just acquire a 1962 Ferrari GTO at auction?" "The Monterey auction, yes. It seemed like a good investment." Margaret was still scrolling through her phone, her excitement growing. "Oh my goodness, William, look at this. He owns property all over the world. There's a penthouse in Manhattan, a compound in the Hamptons, something in Tuscany." "The Tuscany property is actually a vineyard," Alexander clarified. "We produce a small batch Chianti that's done quite well in competitions." I watched my parents absorb this information like they were processing the news that gravity had suddenly reversed. My father, who had spent 30 years building a successful but modest insurance business, was face to face with the reality that the son-in-law he'd been condescending to for 4 years was worth more money than everyone in this room combined, possibly more than everyone they'd ever met combined. "But," my mother started, then stopped, then started again. "But you never mentioned—" "Sophia knows I prefer privacy," Alexander said, reaching for my hand. "I've found that relationships built on financial attraction tend to be less fulfilling than those built on genuine connection." The implications of that statement hit my family like a series of small explosions. Not only was Alexander incredibly wealthy, but he'd deliberately kept it secret, which meant their dismissal of him hadn't been based on his actual worth. It had been based on their shallow assumptions and social prejudices. "The wedding gift," Isabella whispered suddenly, and everyone turned to look at her. "The envelope you sent last week. Marcus said it was just a card." Alexander and I exchanged glances. In the chaos of the revelation and my father's humiliating toast, I'd completely forgotten about the wedding gift Alexander had arranged to be delivered. "Marcus?" my mother prompted sharply. My brother looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. I didn't open it yet. It's upstairs with the other cards." "Perhaps you should retrieve it," Alexander suggested mildly. Marcus practically sprinted toward the manor's main staircase, leaving the rest of us standing in increasingly awkward silence. The other guests were pretending to resume their own conversations, but I could feel the weight of 200 people straining to hear what would happen next. $12 billion, my father repeated numbly, as if saying it might help him process it. "Give or take," Alexander confirmed. "The market fluctuates." Margaret Cumberland laughed, a sound of genuine delight. "Oh, my dear, you've been sitting on the most eligible bachelor in America and you didn't even know it." "He's my husband," I said quietly, speaking for the first time since we'd re-entered the reception hall. "He has been for 4 years. The reminder seemed to hit my parents like a physical blow. For 4 years, they'd had access to one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the world. For 4 years, they'd been dismissing, condescending to, and actively discouraging their own daughter from a marriage that was probably the most advantageous union anyone in our family had ever made. Marcus returned, slightly out of breath, carrying a cream-colored envelope that looked deceptively simple. His hands were shaking slightly as he opened it, pulling out what appeared to be a standard greeting card. But when he opened the card, several papers fell out, and his face went completely white. "What is it?" Isabella demanded. Marcus looked up at Alexander with something approaching awe. It's stock certificates, Thorn Industries stock. Enough to—" he swallowed hard. "Enough to pay off our student loans, the down payment on the house, and probably fund our honeymoon for the next 5 years." The gift was perfect in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Alexander had given my brother more money as a casual wedding present than Marcus made in several years, and he'd done it with the kind of understated generosity that highlighted exactly how small my family's thinking had always been. "Alexander," my mother breathed, "we had no idea. We never. If we had known—" "Known what?" Alexander asked, and his tone had shifted. The politeness was still there, but underneath it was something harder. "If you had known I was wealthy, you would have treated me differently? You would have treated Sophia differently?" The question hung in the air like an indictment, and I watched my parents realize that there was no good answer. Either they admitted they were shallow enough to judge people based on money, or they tried to deny the obvious pattern of their behavior over the past 4 years. But before either of them could respond, Alexander delivered the final blow. "The irony," he said conversationally, "is that Sophia has always been the most successful person in this family. She just married someone who made her success financially irrelevant." Before anyone could respond to Alexander's devastating observation about my being the most successful family member, a new voice cut through the tension that had settled over our group like fog. "Well, I'll be damned." Everyone turned to see Judge Harrison Cumberland, Isabella's grandfather and the patriarch of the Charleston Cumberland family, approaching our circle with his distinctive silver-topped walking cane. At 82, Judge Cumberland was a legend in South Carolina legal and business circles, a man who had built the family fortune from a single hotel into a hospitality empire and still commanded respect from governors and senators. "Judge Cumberland," my father said quickly, clearly hoping the elder statesman might somehow defuse the increasingly uncomfortable situation. "I don't believe you've met my son-in-law, Alexander." "Oh, I know exactly who this young man is, Judge," Cumberland said, extending a weathered but firm hand to Alexander. "Alexander Thorne. I've been following your company's progress with great interest. My financial advisors have been pestering me for months to increase our position in Thorn Industries stock." Alexander shook the judge's hand with obvious respect. "It's an honor to meet you, sir." I've heard wonderful things about your family's business philosophy." "Mutual admiration?" The judge chuckled, then turned his sharp blue eyes on my parents. "Robert, Patricia, I have to say, you've been holding out on us. Having the founder of one of America's most innovative companies as family and not mentioning it. That's either remarkable humility or remarkable oversight." The way he said oversight made it clear which option he thought was more likely. My mother's face had progressed from pale to a splotchy red that clashed terribly with her mother-of-the-groom dress. Alexander is very private about his work," my mother managed weakly. "Privacy is one thing," Judge Cumberland replied, his tone growing cooler. "But I couldn't help overhearing some of the earlier conversation this evening. Something about family disappointments and settling for less." His eyes moved to my father with the kind of judicial stare that had probably made countless lawyers squirm in his courtroom. My father looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. "Judge Cumberland, if there was any misunderstanding—" "Oh, there was no misunderstanding," the judge interrupted firmly. "I heard exactly what you said during your toast, Robert. You called your own daughter a disappointment, in front of my entire family, at my granddaughter's wedding." The temperature in our immediate area seemed to drop several degrees. Isabella looked mortified. Marcus appeared to be calculating whether he could somehow disappear entirely, and my parents both looked like they were facing a firing squad. "What you apparently failed to understand," Judge Cumberland continued, his voice carrying the authority of decades in courtrooms and boardrooms, "is that your daughter didn't settle for less. She married exceptionally well. Not just financially, though that's certainly impressive, but in terms of character, intelligence, and integrity." He turned to address the growing crowd of guests who had been pretending not to listen. "Ladies and gentlemen, for those who don't know, Mr. Thorne here isn't just wealthy. He's revolutionizing entire industries. His company's AI systems are being integrated into everything from autonomous vehicles to medical diagnostics. He's created 40,000 jobs and contributed billions to the economy." Alexander looked slightly uncomfortable with the praise, but Judge Cumberland wasn't finished. "More importantly," the judge said, looking directly at my father, "he's done all of this while maintaining the kind of personal integrity that's increasingly rare in business. Do you know how I know this?" My father shook his head mutely, because 3 years ago, when the Cumberland Hotel Group was looking to upgrade our entire technological infrastructure, Thorne Industries was one of the companies we considered. During the bidding process, Mr. Thorne discovered that one of our executives had been taking kickbacks from a competing firm. Rather than using that information to secure the contract for himself, he reported it directly to me. This was news. To me, Alexander had never mentioned any business dealings with Isabella's family. But then again, there was apparently a lot about his business life that I was just learning. "We lost $2 million to that executive's corruption," Judge Cumberland continued. "But Mr. Thorne's integrity saved us from what could have been a catastrophic long-term partnership with an unethical company. He cost himself a $50 million contract to do the right thing." The weight of this revelation settled over the group like a heavy blanket. Not only was Alexander incredibly successful, but he had demonstrated the kind of moral character that had earned the respect of one of Charleston's most influential families. Respect that apparently predated tonight's revelations by years. "Judge Cumberland," Alexander said quietly, "that really wasn't necessary to mention." "The hell it wasn't," the judge replied with a sharp laugh. "When I see a good man being disrespected by people who should know better, I speak up. It's a habit I developed during 40 years on the bench." He turned back to my parents, and his expression grew stern again. "Robert, Patricia, I've known your family for 15 years? Ever since you started attending First Presbyterian and joined the same country club circles we move in. In all that time, I've watched you chase social connections, worry about appearances, and measure success by the most superficial standards imaginable." My mother opened her mouth to protest, but Judge Cumberland held up a hand. "I'm not finished," he said with the kind of authority that brooked no argument. Tonight, you had the opportunity to celebrate your daughter's remarkable marriage to a man of exceptional achievement and character. Instead, you chose to humiliate her publicly because her success didn't look the way you thought it should. He gestured toward the other guests, many of whom were now openly watching our conversation. Everyone in this room now knows that you publicly called your daughter a disappointment without bothering to understand what she had actually achieved. They know that you dismissed her husband based on superficial judgments and social prejudices. Isabella's mother, Catherine Cumberland, had appeared at her father-in-law's side during his speech. "Daddy Cumberland is right," she said, her voice carrying its own note of disappointment. "Patricia, we've been friends for years, but what you did tonight was unconscionable. Sophia has always been lovely when she's visited, and Alexander has been nothing but gracious during the few times we've met." "Few times?" my mother asked weakly. "Oh, yes," Catherine continued. "Alexander and Sophia have attended several charity events with us in Charleston over the years. The Children's Hospital Gala, the Historic Preservation Fundraiser. Alexander has been quite generous with his donations, actually. Always insists on anonymity, but we know where the checks come from." This was another revelation. During our visits to Charleston, Alexander had sometimes disappeared for a few hours, claiming he had some work calls to make or wanted to explore the city. I'd never questioned it, never thought to ask for details. Now I understood that he'd been actively involved in Charleston's philanthropic community, while my family had been dismissing him as an unambitious nobody. "The Children's Hospital Gala?" Isabella asked, looking confused. "Alexander, you were there. But that's one of the most exclusive events of the year. The tickets alone cost $10,000 per couple," Alexander confirmed quietly. "It's for a good cause." Judge Cumberland nodded approvingly. He's been a major supporter for 3 years running. Never wants any public recognition, never asks for special treatment. Just shows up, writes a check, and mingles with folks like he's anyone else. The implications were staggering. Not only had Alexander been moving in Charleston's highest social circles for years, but he'd been doing so while my family remained completely oblivious. They'd been so focused on their own small-scale social climbing that they'd failed to notice that their despised son-in-law was already operating at a level they could only dream of reaching. "But we never saw you there," my mother protested weakly. "Because you were never invited," Catherine Cumberland said gently but firmly. "Those events are for major donors and community leaders. The guest list is quite selective." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with devastating clarity. While my parents had been desperately trying to climb the social ladder in Charlotte's suburban circles, Alexander had already been accepted into Charleston's most exclusive philanthropic and business communities. He'd been moving in circles that my family couldn't even access, all while they'd been lecturing him about the importance of building connections and achieving real success. Judge Cumberland looked around at the gathered crowd, then back at my parents. "So here's what's going to happen," he said in the tone of a man delivering a verdict. "You're going to apologize to your daughter and her husband, not because they need your approval, they clearly don't, but because it's the right thing to do, and then you're going to think very carefully about how you treat family members in the future." The silence that followed was deafening. My father looked like he was aging years by the minute, while my mother appeared to be fighting back tears of what I could only assume was mortification. But it was Marcus who surprised everyone by stepping forward first. "Sophia," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't defend you during Dad's toast. I'm sorry I've been part of this pattern of making you feel less than. You didn't deserve any of it." It was the first genuine apology I'd heard from any member of my family in years, and coming from Marcus, the golden child, the one who had benefited most from the favoritism, it hit harder than I expected. "Thank you," I said simply, because, in that moment, it was all I could manage. Judge Cumberland nodded approvingly. "That's a start. Now, I believe the evening is still young. and this is supposed to be a celebration. Perhaps we can salvage what's left of the festivities." As he turned to walk away, he paused and looked back at Alexander. "Mr. Thorne, I hope you and Sophia will join us for dinner at the club next week. I have some friends who would very much like to meet you properly." "We'd be honored," Alexander replied. And just like that, the most powerful man at the wedding had not only validated everything about my marriage, but had extended an invitation that my parents had probably been hoping for their entire social climbing lives. An invitation that would never be extended to them, but was being offered freely to the daughter they'd just called a disappointment. After Judge Cumberland's intervention, the reception continued, but the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. I found myself standing near the bar with Alexander, watching my parents navigate conversations where everyone now knew exactly how spectacularly they had misjudged their own family situation. The whispered conversations, the sideways glances, the carefully polite distances that other guests were maintaining. It was all adding up to a social reckoning that was perhaps more devastating than any direct confrontation could have been. But as I sipped my champagne and observed the fallout, I began to piece together just how extensive the web of my family's misconceptions had been. This wasn't just about one humiliating toast or 4 years of casual condescension. This was about a systematic pattern of judgment and dismissal that had shaped every interaction, every family gathering, every major decision for as long as I could remember. I thought about my wedding 4 years ago, the small, intimate ceremony in Seattle that my parents had attended with barely concealed disappointment. "I suppose it's what she wants," my mother had whispered to my aunt during the reception, as if my desire for a meaningful celebration rather than a social spectacle was somehow evidence of my limited aspirations. They'd been embarrassed by the simplicity, by the lack of grandeur, by what they saw as settling for less than I deserved. Now I understood that what they'd actually been witnessing was a wedding planned by 2 people who didn't need to prove anything to anyone, who had chosen intimacy over ostentation because we could afford to prioritize what actually mattered to us. Alexander could have flown in the Vienna Philharmonic and covered Pike Place Market in roses if I'd wanted that kind of celebration. We'd chosen simplicity because it reflected who we were, not because it was all we could afford. Then there were the Christmas gifts. Every year, my parents would shower Marcus with expensive presents, the latest technology, designer clothes, premium golf accessories, while giving Alexander and me practical items that always felt slightly patronizing. "We thought you might need these," my mother would say, handing us a set of kitchen utensils or a modest gift card, "since you're just starting out." Just starting out. For 4 years, they'd treated us like struggling newlyweds who needed help with the basics, while Alexander had been running a company that generated more revenue in a single quarter than most people would see in several lifetimes. The kitchen utensils had been used maybe twice before being relegated to a drawer, not because they weren't nice, but because our kitchen was already fully equipped with professional-grade everything that Alexander had selected with the kind of attention to detail that comes from having unlimited resources and refined taste. I began cataloging the evidence in my mind, piece by piece, building a comprehensive picture of just how thoroughly my family had misunderstood my life. There was the time my father had offered to co-sign a car loan for us, presenting it as a generous gesture that would help us build credit and get into something reliable. Alexander had politely declined, saying we were fine with our current arrangement. What my father didn't know was that our current arrangement included a Porsche Panamera for city driving, a Range Rover for weekend trips, and a vintage Jaguar that Alexander had bought as a surprise for my birthday and kept in a climate-controlled garage. There was my mother's ongoing concern about our retirement planning. "You know, dear," she'd said during one of our phone calls, "your father and I are happy to sit down with you and Alexander to discuss some investment strategies. It's never too early to start thinking about your financial future." I dutifully passed along the offer, and Alexander had responded with genuine gratitude while quietly continuing to manage a diversified portfolio worth more than the GDP of small countries. The college fund conversations had been particularly painful. When Marcus and Isabella had announced their engagement, my parents had immediately started talking about the importance of planning for future grandchildren's education. College costs are astronomical these days, my father had pontificated. Over dinner. You really need to start saving early if you want to give your children the opportunities they deserve. The unspoken implication had been that Alexander and I weren't forward-thinking enough to handle such sophisticated financial planning. What they didn't know was that Alexander had already established education trusts for the children we hadn't even had yet, trusts large enough to send a dozen kids to Harvard without making a dent in our finances. He'd also quietly started funding scholarships at 3 different universities, including a program for first-generation college students that would eventually bear our names, though we'd specifically requested anonymity during our lifetimes. The business advice had been the worst. My father, who ran a successful but regionally limited insurance agency, had repeatedly offered to share his wisdom about building a sustainable enterprise. The key to long-term success, he'd told Alexander during one particularly excruciating dinner conversation, is understanding your market and building relationships. You can't just rely on technical skills in today's economy. Alexander had listened patiently while my father explained basic business principles to someone who had revolutionized multiple industries and regularly consulted with Fortune 500 CEOs. He'd nodded thoughtfully when my father suggested that Alexander should consider networking more aggressively and thinking bigger picture about his career trajectory. At no point had my father considered that maybe, just maybe, the quiet man sitting across from him might already understand business at a level that made his advice not just unnecessary, but almost comically irrelevant. But perhaps the most damaging pattern had been the constant subtle pressure for me to do better. Not just in terms of my marriage, but in my career, my social connections, my life choices in general. Sophia has so much potential, my mother would say to relatives, friends, anyone who would listen. If she would just apply herself more strategically, think about her image, make connections with the right people. The irony was that I had been applying myself strategically, just not in ways my family recognized or valued. While they'd been obsessing over surface-level markers of success, I'd been building genuine expertise in my field, contributing to projects that actually mattered, and yes, building connections with people who were changing the world rather than just talking about it at country club events. My work in sustainable technology consulting had led to partnerships with some of the most innovative companies in the renewable energy sector. I'd helped design systems that were reducing carbon footprints for major corporations, contributed to research that was influencing government policy, and built a professional reputation that opened doors my parents couldn't even imagine existed. But because my work didn't come with a fancy title at a traditional company or result in the kind of social recognition they understood, they'd dismissed it as another example of my failure to reach my potential. Standing there at the reception, watching my parents try to salvage their social standing after the evening's revelations, I realized that the evidence of their misconceptions wasn't just about money or business success. It was about values, about what they chose to see and what they chose to ignore, about their fundamental inability to recognize worth that didn't fit their narrow definitions of achievement. Alexander appeared at my elbow with a fresh glass of champagne. "You look like you're thinking hard about something," he observed. "I'm just processing," I said, trying to understand how we got here, how they could have been so wrong about everything for so long. "People see what they expect to see," he said quietly. "Your parents expected you to struggle, so they interpreted everything through that lens. They expected me to be ordinary, so they missed all the signs that suggested otherwise." "But there were so many signs," I protested. "The way you traveled for work, the way you never worried about money, the way you seemed comfortable in any situation." There were signs if someone was looking for them, Alexander agreed. But your family wasn't looking. They'd already decided who we were and what our life together meant. Evidence that contradicted their assumptions was either ignored or reinterpreted to fit their narrative. I thought about that for a moment, watching my father attempt to engage Judge Cumberland in conversation while the older man politely but firmly maintained his distance. They're going to want to fix this, I said finally. Once they fully process what happened tonight, they're going to want to repair the relationship. Probably, Alexander agreed. The question is whether they'll want to fix it because they recognize they were wrong about fundamental things, or because they've realized that maintaining a relationship with us is now socially and financially advantageous. It was a distinction that cut to the heart of everything. Were my parents capable of genuine reflection and growth, or would they simply recalibrate their behavior based on new information about our net worth and social connections? Would they apologize because they understood they'd been cruel and wrong, or because they'd discovered that continuing to dismiss us would cost them more than they'd realized? As I watched my mother approach a group of Isabella's relatives with obvious nervousness, trying to gauge whether her social standing had been permanently damaged by the evening's events, I suspected I already knew the answer. The question now was what Alexander and I were going to do with that knowledge. Whatever happens next, I said, taking his hand, I'm glad the truth is finally out there. Even if it makes things more complicated? I looked around the reception hall, at the guests who were now treating us with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect, at my brother who seemed to be genuinely grappling with his role in years of family dysfunction, at my parents who were discovering that actions have consequences even when you don't expect them to, especially because it makes things more complicated, I said. Simple was them thinking they understood everything. Complicated means they have to actually figure out who we really are. The confrontation I'd been both dreading and anticipating came about an hour later when the reception had settled into its final phase. Most of the older guests had begun making their polite departures, and the remaining crowd had shifted toward the more casual after-party atmosphere that weddings typically develop in their later hours. The band had transitioned from elegant classical pieces to more contemporary music, and the lighting had been dimmed to create a more intimate ambiance. I was standing near the French doors again, getting some air and watching Alexander engage in what appeared to be a fascinating conversation with several of Charleston's most prominent business leaders, when I felt a presence behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was my father. I could sense the nervous energy radiating from him like heat from a furnace. Sophia, he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight I'd rarely heard before. Could we talk? Privately. I turned to face him, noting the way his usually confident posture had deflated. His bow tie was slightly askew, his face had a grayish pallor that aged him considerably, and his hands were trembling almost imperceptibly. This wasn't the commanding patriarch who had delivered that devastating toast earlier in the evening. This was a man who had just realized he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. "What would you like to talk about, Dad?" I asked, keeping my voice level and neutral. He glanced around nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the possibility of being overheard. "Perhaps we could step outside? Into the gardens?" I followed him down the stone steps into the manor's formal gardens, where paper lanterns strung between ancient oak trees cast dancing shadows on the manicured pathways. The sound of the reception faded to a gentle background hum, replaced by the evening chorus of crickets and the distant sound of fountain water. "Sophia," he began, then stopped, running his hand through his hair in a gesture I recognized from my childhood, something he did when he was struggling to find the right words. I owe you an apology?" I suggested when he seemed unable to complete the sentence. "More than an apology," he said heavily. "I need to explain. I need you to understand that I never meant to hurt you the way I did tonight." I waited, giving him space to continue, though part of me was already analyzing his words. "I never meant to hurt you" was different from "I was wrong" or "I shouldn't have said those things." It was the language of someone who regretted consequences rather than actions. "Your mother and I," he continued, "we've always worried about you. You're so independent, so determined to do things your own way. We were afraid you weren't thinking practically about your future." "Practically," I repeated. "You mean financially?" "Well, yes." He had the grace to look uncomfortable admitting it. "Marriage is a partnership, Sophia. It's about building a life together, creating stability, planning for the future. When you married Alexander, we were concerned that you were prioritizing feelings over practical considerations." The irony was so profound it was almost funny. "So you were worried that I was being too romantic? Too focused on love instead of money?" "Not money, exactly," he protested, though we both knew that was exactly what he meant. "Security, stability, the kind of foundation that lets a marriage weather difficult times." I looked at my father, really looked at him, and saw a man who had spent his entire adult life believing that success could be measured in clear, quantifiable terms. House size, car model, job title, social connections. He'd built a comfortable life based on these metrics, and he genuinely believed that by encouraging me to find a husband who scored higher on these measures, he was looking out for my best interests. "Dad," I said slowly, "what exactly did you think was going to happen to Alexander and me? What catastrophe were you so worried about?" He shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know. Economic downturns affect tech workers disproportionately. What if he lost his job? What if you couldn't find work? What if you got sick and couldn't afford medical care? What if you wanted to start a family but couldn't afford to take time off?" Each hypothetical scenario revealed just how completely he'd misunderstood our situation. I found myself in the surreal position of wanting to comfort him, while also needing to confront the fundamental assumptions that had led to years of condescension and tonight's public humiliation. "Those are all valid concerns for many couples," I said carefully. "But Dad, you never asked about our actual financial situation. You never inquired about Alexander's work in any detail. You made assumptions based on surface appearances and then treated those assumptions as facts." "He drives a Honda," my father said defensively, as if this somehow justified years of dismissive behavior. "He drives a Honda in Seattle because he prefers not to attract attention," I replied. "In Manhattan, he has a driver. In London, he uses the company Bentley. In Los Angeles, he drives a Tesla because he's environmentally conscious. The Honda isn't a statement about his financial limitations. It's a choice that reflects his values." My father stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. But he never talked about his success. He never mentioned his achievements. How were we supposed to know? "You could have asked," I said simply. "Instead of lecturing him about networking and career advancement, you could have asked about his work. Instead of offering unsolicited financial advice, you could have inquired about our goals and plans. Instead of assuming we were struggling, you could have paid attention to the evidence that we weren't." "What evidence?" he asked, and I realized he genuinely didn't understand. "Dad, in 4 years, did Alexander and I ever ask you for money? Did we ever seem stressed about bills or expenses? Did we ever decline to participate in family activities because of cost? Did we ever seem envious of Marcus's lifestyle or express dissatisfaction with our own situation?" He was quiet for a long moment, processing these questions. "No," he admitted finally. "But you're both so understated, so modest. We thought you were just making the best of a difficult situation. Or," I suggested, "we were two people who were perfectly happy with our life and didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone." The distinction seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He sank down onto a nearby garden bench, suddenly looking every one of his 63 years. "The toast?" he said quietly. "What I said about you being a disappointment was heard by 200 people, including some of the most influential families in Charleston," I finished. People who, as it turns out, already knew and respected Alexander. People who are now wondering what kind of man publicly humiliates his own daughter at a family wedding. He flinched. I was trying to highlight Marcus's achievements. I thought it would make his success seem more impressive by contrast. By using me as the failure story, I said. By reducing my entire life to a cautionary tale about settling for less. I didn't mean it that way. But that's how you said it. And that's how everyone heard it. And Dad? I paused, making sure he was looking at me. That's how you've been treating me for years. Tonight wasn't an aberration. It was just the first time you said out loud what you've been thinking all along. The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of truths that couldn't be taken back. Finally, my father looked up at me with something that might have been genuine remorse. "What can I do to fix this?" he asked. It was the question I'd been waiting for, but now that it had come, I found myself unsure how to answer. Because the real question wasn't what he could do to fix the immediate situation, the public embarrassment, the social awkwardness, the family tension. The real question was whether he was capable of fundamentally changing how he thought about success, value, and worth. "I don't know if you can fix this," I said honestly. "You can apologize, certainly. You can acknowledge that you were wrong about Alexander, about our marriage, about our life. But Dad, the deeper issue is that you've spent 4 years treating your own daughter like she wasn't smart enough to make good decisions about her own life." "That's not true," he protested. "Isn't it? Every piece of unsolicited advice, every expression of concern about our future, every comparison to Marcus's more impressive achievements, all of it was based on the assumption that I had somehow failed to live up to my potential." He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, apparently realizing that any defense would only prove my point. "The thing is," I continued, "even if Alexander had been exactly what you thought he was, a struggling tech worker with modest prospects, your behavior still would have been wrong, because the measure of a good marriage isn't the husband's bank account or social status. It's whether two people love and respect each other, whether they support each other's dreams, whether they build a life together that makes them both happy." "And you are happy?" he asked quietly. "Extraordinarily happy," I replied without hesitation. "I have a husband who loves me unconditionally, who supports my career, who treats me as an equal partner in all decisions. I have meaningful work that I'm passionate about. I have financial security beyond most people's wildest dreams. I have a life that reflects my values and priorities." I paused, letting that sink in before delivering the final point. "The only thing missing from my happiness, Dad, has been the feeling that my own family respected my choices and believed in my judgment. And after tonight, I'm not sure that's something you're capable of giving me." The aftermath of my conversation with my father became apparent the moment we returned to the reception. The carefully orchestrated social dynamics that had governed the evening had completely unraveled, replaced by a palpable tension that seemed to follow my family wherever they went. I watched from across the room as my mother attempted to engage in small talk with Isabella's Aunt Margaret, only to be met with polite but notably cooler responses than she'd received earlier in the evening. But it was Marcus who surprised me by making the first public move. About 20 minutes after my father and I had returned from the gardens, my brother approached the microphone that had been used for the earlier toasts. The band paused mid-song, and conversations throughout the hall gradually quieted as guests realized someone was about to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system but lacking his usual confident tone. "I know it's unusual to have another speech this late in the evening, but I have something I need to say." I felt Alexander's hand find mine as we turned our attention to my brother. Isabella, standing near the head table, looked concerned, clearly having no idea what Marcus was planning to say. "Earlier tonight, my father gave a toast that honored my marriage to Isabella," Marcus continued. "But in doing so, he said some things about my sister Sophia that were not only untrue, but deeply unfair. A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not typical wedding reception fare, and the guests seemed unsure whether to be uncomfortable or fascinated by the unexpected family drama playing out before them. "I've had the privilege tonight of learning more about my sister's life than I've known in years," Marcus said, his eyes finding mine across the room. "And what I've discovered is that while our family has been measuring success by traditional standards, Sophia has been living a life that exceeds those standards in ways we never bothered to understand." He paused, gathering courage for what came next. "My sister's husband, Alexander, isn't just successful. He's one of the most accomplished entrepreneurs of our generation. But more importantly, Sophia herself has built a career in sustainable technology that's making a real difference in the world. She's contributed to projects that are changing how major corporations approach environmental responsibility. She's been invited to speak at international conferences. She's collaborated with researchers who are influencing government policy." I felt a flush of surprise. Marcus had clearly done some research during the evening, probably asking the right questions of the right people to get a fuller picture of what Alexander and I had actually accomplished. "The point is," Marcus continued, "our family owes Sophia and Alexander an apology. Not just for tonight, but for years of failing to see them clearly, failing to appreciate what they've built together, and failing to recognize that sometimes the most impressive success is the kind that doesn't need to announce itself." The applause that followed was scattered but sincere, and I noticed that Judge Cumberland was nodding approvingly while my parents looked like they wanted to disappear. Entirely. But Marcus wasn't finished. "I also want to publicly thank Alexander for his incredibly generous wedding gift," he said, holding up the stock certificates that had fallen from the card earlier. "This gift will literally change Isabella's and my financial future, and it was given not because Alexander needed to prove anything, but because that's the kind of man he is." The crowd's reaction was immediate and audible. Gasps, whispers, and what sounded like genuine appreciation for the gesture rippled through the reception hall. I could see Isabella beaming with what appeared to be newfound respect for her new brother-in-law. "So," Marcus concluded, "while this is still my and Isabella's wedding day, I want it to also be a celebration of the family I'm lucky to be part of, all of it, including the sister and brother-in-law who have shown me what real class and generosity look like." The applause this time was sustained and enthusiastic, but as Marcus stepped away from the microphone, I could see that his public acknowledgement had created as many problems as it had solved. My parents, who had been trying to quietly manage the social fallout from the evening's earlier revelations, now found themselves in the position of having their own son publicly contradict the narrative they'd been attempting to maintain. Within minutes, the social media implications became apparent. I noticed several guests discreetly taking photos, not of the decorations or the happy couple, but of Alexander and me. Isabella's younger cousins, who had been largely ignoring the adult drama, suddenly seemed fascinated by the presence of an actual billionaire at their family gathering. "Sophia!" called out Priscilla Cumberland, Isabella's 20-something cousin who worked in marketing for a fashion company in New York. "My friends are never going to believe I met Alexander Thorne at a wedding. Would you mind if I got a photo?" Before I could respond, other young guests had gathered around, phones emerging from purses and jacket pockets. What started as a simple photo request quickly escalated into something resembling a red carpet moment, with people waiting in line for selfies and asking Alexander questions about his business ventures. "This is surreal," I whispered to Alexander, as we posed for yet another photo. "This is what happens when people realize they're in the presence of someone they've read about in Forbes," he replied quietly. "Are you okay with it?" I looked around at the crowd of eager faces, at the phones capturing moments that would undoubtedly be shared across social media platforms within the hour, at my parents standing awkwardly on the periphery of a social whirlwind they had no idea how to navigate. "Actually," I said, "I think I am okay with it. Because what was happening wasn't just about celebrity or wealth or social media attention. It was about public validation of something my family had refused to see. Every photo, every excited conversation, every expression of amazement at meeting Alexander was evidence that the rest of the world understood what my parents had missed. But the real moment of public escalation came when Catherine Cumberland approached the growing crowd around Alexander and me. "Excuse me," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "but I think people should know that Alexander and Sophia have been major supporters of Charleston's Children's Hospital for several years. Their donations have funded a new pediatric wing that's going to save countless lives." The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Suddenly, we weren't just the billionaire couple from Seattle. We were philanthropists who had been quietly making a difference in the local community. The respect in people's eyes shifted from impressed curiosity to genuine admiration. "The new pediatric wing?" asked Dr. Morrison, Isabella's cousin who worked at the hospital. "That was funded by you?" Alexander nodded modestly. It seemed like a worthy cause. "A worthy cause?" Dr. Morrison laughed. "That wing is going to revolutionize pediatric care in the Southeast. We've been able to recruit world-class specialists because of the facilities you provided." By now, a significant portion of the reception had gathered around our impromptu receiving line. Stories were being shared, connections were being made, and Alexander was fielding questions about everything from his business philosophy to his investment strategies to his philanthropic priorities. And through it all, my parents stood at the edge of the crowd, watching their despised son-in-law hold court with Charleston's social and business elite, realizing that the man they'd been condescending to for 4 years was being treated with the kind of deference they'd spent their entire lives hoping to achieve. The ultimate irony came when William Cumberland pulled my father aside for what appeared to be a serious conversation. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I could see my father's face growing increasingly pale as Isabella's father spoke. Later, I would learn that William had been asking my father about investment opportunities, assuming that someone related to Alexander Thorne must have access to exclusive deals or insider information. The misunderstanding was both painful and perfect. My father was being treated as important by association, while simultaneously being reminded that his own judgment about what constituted importance had been catastrophically wrong. "I think," Alexander said quietly as we finally extracted ourselves from the crowd, "your family is beginning to understand the full scope of their miscalculation." I looked across the room at my parents, who were now sitting alone at a table, watching the social dynamics they'd tried so hard to master play out around my husband and me. They looked lost, diminished, like people who had suddenly realized they'd been playing a game whose rules they'd never actually understood. "The question is," I replied, "whether they're capable of learning from it, or whether they'll just recalibrate their behavior to match what they now know about our net worth." As if to answer my question, my mother chose that moment to approach us, her face wearing an expression I'd never seen before, a combination of desperation, shame, and what looked like carefully calculated charm. "Sophia, darling," she said, her voice bright with forced enthusiasm. "Mrs. Cumberland was just telling me about your work with the Children's Hospital. I had no idea you and Alexander were so involved in charitable work. We should definitely talk about ways our family could support these kinds of causes." And there it was, the recalibration I'd been expecting. Not an acknowledgement of years of misjudgment, but an immediate attempt to position themselves as part of our philanthropic success story. Alexander's smile was polite but cool. "That's very kind of you to offer, Mrs. Blackwell. Though, of course, meaningful charitable work requires genuine commitment and careful consideration of how best to make a real impact." The subtle rebuke was perfectly delivered, acknowledging her offer while making it clear that charity wasn't something you could simply decide to dabble in for social advantage. My mother's smile flickered but held. "Of course, I just think It's wonderful that our family is making such a difference in the community. Our family. As if she hadn't spent the entire evening treating Alexander and me like the disappointing relatives who didn't quite belong. Realize then that this was going to be the real test. Not whether my family could apologize for one night of public humiliation, but whether they could resist the temptation to rewrite history now that the truth about our success was public knowledge. The formal resolution came the next morning, though I didn't expect it to happen so quickly or so definitively. Alexander and I had stayed overnight at the Charleston Harbor Resort rather than driving back to the family house, partly because we wanted space to process the evening's events, and partly because we both knew that spending the night under my parents' roof would have created an unbearably awkward situation for everyone involved. We were having breakfast on the hotel's waterfront terrace when Judge Cumberland arrived, unannounced but not unwelcome, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the kind of serious expression that suggested this wasn't a social call. "Mr. and Mrs. Thorne," he said, approaching our table with the measured steps of someone who had spent decades making important decisions. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I have a proposition that I believe will be of mutual interest." Alexander stood to shake his hand, gesturing for the judge to join us. "Not at all, sir. Please sit down. Can we order you some coffee?" "That would be lovely," Judge Cumberland replied, settling into his chair and placing the portfolio carefully on the table. "I've been up since 5 this morning, making phone calls to various board members and community leaders. I felt a flutter of curiosity mixed with apprehension. Board members? Several boards, actually, the judge said with a slight smile. The Children's Hospital Foundation, the Charleston Preservation Society, the Economic Development Council, and the United Way, among others. You see, after last night's revelations, it occurred to me that Charleston has been missing an extraordinary opportunity." A server appeared with coffee for the judge, and he paused to take a thoughtful sip before continuing. "For 3 years, Mr. Thorne, you've been quietly supporting our community through substantial donations and strategic investments. But you've done so from the shadows, never allowing us to properly acknowledge your contributions or leverage your expertise for broader community benefit." Alexander looked intrigued, but cautious. "I've always preferred to keep philanthropy separate from publicity." "And that discretion is admirable," Judge Cumberland replied. "But it's also deprived our city of the full benefit of your involvement. Last night, I watched some of Charleston's most prominent business leaders discover that they'd been socializing with one of the country's most successful entrepreneurs, without even knowing it. The missed opportunities for collaboration, for economic development, for innovative problem-solving. It's staggering when you think about it." He opened his portfolio and extracted several documents. "So I've spent the morning proposing a formal partnership. The City of Charleston would like to invite you to join the Economic Development Council as a special advisor for technology and innovation. The Children's Hospital would like to name you to their board of directors, and the Preservation Society would like to discuss your potential involvement in a sustainable tourism initiative that could serve as a model for historic cities nationwide." I looked at Alexander, trying to gauge his reaction. These weren't just honorary positions being offered. They were real roles with real responsibilities, the kind of community leadership positions that my parents had spent their entire lives hoping to be considered for. "But there's more," Judge Cumberland continued, his eyes twinkling with something that looked like satisfaction. "The Charleston Chamber of Commerce would like to host a formal reception in your honor, both of you, to properly introduce you to the community and acknowledge your contributions to the region." "A reception?" I asked. "A significant social event," the judge clarified. "The kind of gathering that brings together government officials, business leaders, cultural figures, and philanthropic organizations. The mayor will be there, of course. The governor has already expressed interest in attending. Several Fortune 500 CEOs who have operations in the region." The implications were staggering. This wasn't just community recognition. It was formal acknowledgement at the highest levels of South Carolina society and business. The kind of event that would establish Alexander and me as permanent fixtures in Charleston's power structure. Judge Cumberland, Alexander said carefully, this is incredibly generous, but I have to ask, is this being offered because of what happened last night? Because if it is, I'm not sure that's the right foundation for a community partnership. The older man's expression grew more serious. That's a fair question, and I appreciate you asking it directly. The answer is both yes and no. Yes, last night's events accelerated these conversations and made various board members realize we'd been overlooking obvious opportunities. But no, this isn't a knee-jerk reaction to social embarrassment. He leaned forward, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a carefully considered verdict. The truth is, Mr. Thorne, we should have been having these conversations 3 years ago when you first began supporting our institutions. The fact that we didn't was our failure, not yours. Last night simply made us confront our own short-sightedness. He turned to include me in his direct gaze. And, Mrs. Thorne, your work in sustainable technology consulting is exactly the kind of expertise our preservation and development initiatives need. We've been struggling with how to modernize our infrastructure while maintaining our historic character. Your background in environmental systems could be transformative for our planning efforts. The offer was tempting, but it also felt complicated. Accepting these positions would mean formally establishing ourselves as Charleston power brokers, which would fundamentally change our relationship with my family and the social dynamics that had governed our interactions for years. There's something else, Judge Cumberland added, his tone shifting to something more personal. I believe this formal recognition would also serve as a very public statement about the values our community chooses to honor. Leadership isn't just about wealth or business success. It's about integrity, discretion, and genuine commitment to making a difference. Those are the qualities you've both demonstrated, and those are the qualities we want to celebrate. I understood what he wasn't saying directly. This reception, these board appointments, this formal recognition, it would all serve as a very public rebuke to the kind of thinking my parents had displayed. It would demonstrate that Charleston's real power structure valued substance over surface, genuine achievement over social positioning. What kind of timeline are we talking about? Alexander asked. The reception could be organized within 6 weeks, Judge Cumberland replied. The board appointments could be formalized even sooner. The Economic Development Council meets next Thursday, and they're prepared to vote on your advisory position at that meeting. Alexander looked at me, clearly wanting to gauge my feelings about the prospect. I thought about what accepting would mean, not just for us, but for my family. My parents, who had spent decades trying to break into Charleston's inner circles, would have to watch their dismissed daughter and despised son-in-law be formally welcomed into the exact social and professional network they'd always coveted. There's one more thing, I said, looking directly at Judge Cumberland. Last night was difficult for my family. If we accept these positions, if we become public figures in Charleston society, it's going to create ongoing complications in our family relationships. Judge Cumberland nodded thoughtfully. I understand your concern, but Mrs. Thorne, with respect, those complications already exist. The question is whether you're going to let family dysfunction prevent you from contributing to your community in meaningful ways. He paused, then added more gently, sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family members is to model what healthy success actually looks like, rather than enabling their misconceptions. Alexander reached for my hand across the table. It's your decision, he said quietly. These are your family relationships that would be most affected. I thought about the previous evening, my father's devastating toast, the public humiliation, the social whirlwind that had followed Alexander's revelation. I thought about years of condescension and dismissal, of being treated like the family disappointment who had settled for less than she deserved. But I also thought about the children's hospital wing that would save lives, the sustainable technology, projects that could transform how historic cities approached modernization, the economic development opportunities that could benefit thousands of people. Judge Cumberland, I said finally, We accept. All of it. The board positions, the advisory role, the reception. We'd be honored to serve. The smile that spread across the older man's face was genuinely delighted. Excellent. I'll begin making the necessary arrangements immediately. As he gathered his documents and prepared to leave, he paused and looked at both of us with an expression that seemed almost paternal. You know, he said, in 40 years of community service, I've learned that the people who deserve recognition the most are usually the ones who seek it the least. Last night reminded me why that's such an important principle. After he left, Alexander and I sat in comfortable silence, watching boats move slowly across Charleston Harbor while processing what had just happened. In less than 24 hours, we'd gone from being the overlooked relatives at a family wedding to being formally invited into Charleston's power structure. No going back now, Alexander said finally. No, I agreed. And honestly, I think that's exactly what needed to happen. Because sometimes the only way to heal a toxic family dynamic is to remove yourself from it entirely, to build something so undeniably valuable that the toxicity becomes irrelevant. Sometimes the most powerful response to being called a disappointment is to let the community itself decide what you're really worth. The reception would be held in 6 weeks, and by then, everyone in Charleston would know exactly who Sophia and Alexander Thorne really were. Not the family disappointments my parents had made us out to be, but community leaders whose contributions had been quietly shaping the city for years. It was going to be quite an evening. The phone call started. 3 days after the wedding. First my mother, then my father, then Marcus, each reaching out with carefully worded messages that danced around what had really happened while attempting to gauge whether our family relationships could somehow be salvaged. I let most of them go to voicemail initially, needing time to process not just the wedding night revelations, but the magnitude of what accepting Judge Cumberland's offers would mean for our future. But it was an unexpected visitor who forced the final reckoning. I was working in my home office in Seattle, reviewing proposals for the Charleston Preservation Society's Sustainable Tourism Initiative, when our housekeeper announced that someone was at the door asking to speak with me. Through the security monitor, I saw a woman I didn't immediately recognize. Well-dressed, probably in her 50s, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she was working up courage for a difficult conversation. When I opened the door, she introduced herself as Rebecca Martin, and the name didn't immediately register until she added, "I'm Patricia Blackwell's sister, your Aunt Rebecca." I hadn't seen Rebecca in probably 15 years, not since a cousin's wedding when I was still in college. She lived in Atlanta, worked in real estate development, and had always been the more successful of the two sisters, a fact that my mother had mentioned with a mixture of pride and envy over the years. "Aunt Rebecca," I said, genuinely surprised. "What are you doing in Seattle?" "I came to see you," she said simply. "I was at Marcus's wedding. I heard what happened, and I think there are some things you need to know about your family that might help you understand why things played out the way they did." I invited her in, offering coffee and settling into the living room that Alexander had furnished with the kind of understated luxury that whispered, rather than shouted about our financial circumstances. Rebecca looked around with obvious appreciation, taking in details that my parents had somehow missed during their visits. The museum-quality art, the custom millwork, the view of Elliott Bay that was worth more than most people's houses. "First," Rebecca said, accepting a cup of coffee, "I owe you an apology. I should have spoken up years ago when I started noticing how Patricia and Robert talked about you and Alexander. But family dynamics are complicated, and I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere." "What do you mean how they talked about us?" Rebecca sighed, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Sophia, your parents have been struggling financially for the past several years. More than struggling, actually. Robert's insurance business has been losing clients to larger firms, and they've been living on credit and borrowed money for longer than they've let anyone know." This was news to me. My parents had never mentioned financial difficulties, had never asked for help, had continued to live in their comfortable suburban home and maintain their country club memberships and social activities. When Marcus started dating Isabella, Rebecca continued, it felt like salvation to them, not just because she's lovely, but because her family represents the kind of financial security and social connections they've been desperately seeking. The Cumberland connection became their lifeline, literally and figuratively. I began to understand where this was heading, but Rebecca pressed on. They've been borrowing money from me for the past 2 years, she admitted. First, it was just help with the mortgage during a rough patch. Then it was country club dues because they couldn't bear the social humiliation of having to resign. Then it was wedding expenses because they were determined to make Marcus's wedding look appropriately affluent. The picture she was painting was devastating in its implications. My parents, who had spent years lecturing Alexander and me about financial planning and practical considerations, had been living beyond their means while desperately trying to maintain an image of success. But here's the part that really matters, Rebecca said, her voice growing firmer. They knew. About Alexander, about his company. They've known for at least 18 months. I felt the blood drain from my face. What do you mean they knew? I told them, Rebecca said, looking ashamed. I was having dinner with Patricia, and she was going on about how worried she was about your financial future, how Alexander seemed nice but not very ambitious. I got frustrated and did some research on my phone, right there at the table. I showed her the Forbes article, the business profiles, the net worth estimates. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. They knew Alexander was successful, and they still treated both of you like you were struggling newlyweds who needed their guidance, Rebecca finished. Patricia's response was that anyone could look successful on paper, that tech money wasn't real money, that you were probably living paycheck to paycheck despite what the internet said. I stared at my aunt, trying to process this information. My parents hadn't just been wrong about our situation. They had been presented with evidence of their misconceptions and had chosen to ignore it, to maintain their narrative regardless of facts. There's more, Rebecca said gently. Robert has been asking me about whether I thought Alexander might be willing to invest in his business. He's been fantasizing about somehow getting access to Alexander's connections, maybe turning things around through family networking. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. While publicly dismissing Alexander as unambitious and financially unreliable, my father had been privately hoping to benefit from exactly the success he'd been denying existed. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because what happened at the wedding was unconscionable, Rebecca said firmly. And because I think you deserve to know that their behavior wasn't just based on ignorance or misunderstanding. It was based on willful denial and, frankly, jealousy. Jealousy? Sophia, you accomplished everything they've been desperately trying to achieve. You married into wealth and success, but you did it authentically, by finding someone who loved you for who you are. They've been trying to climb the social ladder through country club memberships and strategic relationships, while you've been living the life they actually wanted without even trying. The conversation continued for another hour, with Rebecca filling in details about family financial struggles, about conversations she'd overheard, about the growing desperation that had culminated in my father's decision to use me as a foil, to highlight Marcus's more socially acceptable success. But the most devastating revelation came as she was preparing to leave. There's one more thing, she said hesitantly. The night before the wedding, Patricia called me in tears. She said she was terrified that the Cumberland family would discover how precarious their financial situation really was, that they'd somehow been found out as frauds pretending to be more successful than they were. And I told her that maybe, instead of worrying about being exposed as less successful than they appeared, she should focus on appreciating the family members who were actually successful. I suggested that maybe Alexander and you could be assets to the family rather than embarrassments. Rebecca paused, looking directly at me. She said that would never work because you and Alexander didn't understand how to present success properly. that you were too modest, too understated, too unwilling to leverage your advantages for social benefit. She said having wealthy relatives was useless if they insisted on acting like regular people. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. My parents hadn't just been wrong about our success. They'd been resentful of how we'd chosen to live with that success. They'd wanted us to be wealthy, but only if we were willing to use that wealth in ways that elevated their own social status. When Rebecca left, I sat alone in my living room, looking out at the Seattle skyline and processing the full scope of what I'd learned. The wedding night humiliation hadn't been an aberration or a moment of poor judgment. It had been the culmination of years of resentment, financial desperation, and willful denial. My phone buzzed with another voicemail from my mother, probably the 5th attempt she'd made to reach me since the wedding. This time, I listened to it. Sophia, honey, it's Mom again. I know you're probably upset about the other night, but I think there's been some misunderstanding. We need to talk about how we can all move forward as a family. There are so many opportunities now for us to work together, to support each other. Call me back. We love you. The message was perfectly crafted to avoid taking responsibility while positioning my parents as ready to embrace the opportunities that my success represented. But after my conversation with Rebecca, I could hear what was really being said. Now that your wealth is public knowledge, we're ready to figure out how to benefit from it. That evening, when Alexander returned from a day of virtual meetings with his international offices, I told him everything Rebecca had shared. He listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grim as the full picture emerged. So, they've known the truth about our situation for 18 months, he said finally, and chose to ignore it because it didn't fit their preferred narrative, I confirmed. And now they want to reconcile because maintaining a relationship with us has become financially and socially advantageous. Exactly. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, then looked at me with the kind of resolve I'd seen in his business. Negotiations. Then I think it's time to make a final decision about what kind of relationship, if any, we want to have with your family going forward. The conversation we had that night would determine not just our family relationships, but how we chose to use our success, our community standing, and our newfound position in Charleston society. Because now we knew that any reconciliation wouldn't be based on genuine remorse or growth. It would be based on calculated self-interest, and that knowledge changed everything about what our response needed to be. The Charleston reception took place 6 weeks later, on a perfect October evening, when the autumn air carried just enough coolness to make the outdoor terraces of the historic Charleston Foundation building comfortable for mingling. Alexander and I arrived fashionably on time, having spent the previous hour in our hotel suite preparing not just our appearance, but our emotional readiness for what would essentially be our formal debut as Charleston society fixtures. The guest list read like a who's who of Southern power brokers. Governor Mitchell and his wife, Mayor Harrison, 3 Fortune 500 CEOs, federal judges, university presidents, and virtually every prominent family name from the Carolinas. The kind of gathering my parents had spent their entire adult lives dreaming of being invited to, now happening in our honor. But it was the smaller details that made the evening particularly meaningful. Dr. Morrison from the Children's Hospital had brought photos of the new pediatric wing, showing Alexander and me the state-of-the-art equipment our donations had made possible. The mayor presented us with keys to the city, a largely ceremonial gesture, but one that carried real symbolic weight in a place like Charleston where tradition mattered. Judge Cumberland had arranged for several of the city's most prominent business leaders to discuss potential collaborations with Alexander's company, genuine opportunities that could bring hundreds of high-paying jobs to the region. About halfway through the evening, as Alexander was deep in conversation with a group of sustainable development experts about transforming Charleston's approach to historic preservation, I spotted a familiar figure near the entrance. Marcus had arrived, looking uncomfortable but determined, wearing what I recognized as his best suit and the expression of someone who had something important to say. He approached me while I was standing with Catherine Cumberland and several other women who were discussing the upcoming charity auction season. "Sophia," he said quietly, "could I have a word?" I excused myself from the conversation and walked with him to a quieter corner of the terrace, overlooking the Charleston harbor, where lights from passing boats created gentle reflections on the dark water. "I wasn't sure if I should come," Marcus began, "but Isabella convinced me that I needed to see this, to see you being honored the way you deserve." "How did you even get an invitation?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Judge Cumberland," Marcus replied. "He called me last week and said that while our parents' behavior had been inexcusable, he thought it was important for family members who were willing to acknowledge their mistakes to have the chance to do so publicly." I looked at my brother, really looked at him, and saw something I hadn't expected: genuine remorse mixed with what appeared to be newfound respect. "Sophia, I've spent the past 6 weeks thinking about everything that happened at my wedding," he continued. "About how long our family has treated you like you were somehow failing at life. About how we never bothered to really understand what you'd built with Alexander. And what conclusion did you reach?" "That I've been an idiot," he said simply. "That we all have been. But more than that, I think I finally understand why you moved across the country, why you kept your distance from family events, why you never seemed particularly interested in our approval." He gestured toward the reception, where Alexander was now surrounded by a group of tech entrepreneurs who had apparently driven down from Research Triangle Park specifically to meet him. "You didn't need our approval because you'd already built something better than anything we understood how to recognize. You found genuine success, not just financial but personal and professional, and you did it without compromising who you are or pretending to be someone else." The apology felt different from his wedding night speech, more thoughtful and less performative, but I needed to know if he understood the full scope of what had happened. "Marcus, do you know that Mom and Dad knew about Alexander's company? That they've known for over a year and chose to ignore it?" His face fell. "Rebecca told me. She called me after she visited you in Seattle. And I realized that what happened at my wedding wasn't just a mistake or poor judgment. It was deliberate. They chose to humiliate you even though they knew the truth about your life." The admission hung between us for a moment before Marcus continued. "I also know about their financial situation, about the money they've borrowed from Rebecca, about Dad's business struggles, about how desperate they've been to maintain appearances. How do you feel about that?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the harbor. "Honestly, I feel manipulated. I think they've been using my relationship with Isabella as their ticket to social respectability, and they were terrified that having you and Alexander there would somehow expose them as less successful than they pretended to be. It was a more sophisticated understanding than I'd expected from my brother, and it suggested that he'd been doing some serious thinking about family dynamics. The thing is," Marcus continued, "I don't want to be part of that anymore. Isabella and I have been talking, and we've decided that we want our marriage to be based on genuine connection, not social climbing or family pressure." "What does that mean practically?" "It means we're moving to Charlotte but buying our own house without help from either family. It means we're going to build our own social circle based on our actual interests and values. And it means we want to have a relationship with you and Alexander that's separate from whatever dysfunction exists with Mom and Dad." Before I could respond, Alexander appeared at my elbow, looking slightly overwhelmed but pleased. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, "but Governor Mitchell wants to discuss the possibility of establishing a technology innovation hub in Charleston, and he'd like both of us to be involved in the planning committee." The irony was perfect. While my parents sat at home, probably watching local news coverage of the reception and realizing exactly what they'd lost, Alexander and I were being invited to help shape South Carolina's economic future. "Marcus," I said, "I'd like you to meet some people." For the next hour, I introduced my brother to various guests, watching as he navigated conversations with genuine curiosity, rather than the social calculation I'd grown accustomed to seeing from our family. He asked thoughtful questions about the charitable initiatives being discussed, expressed genuine interest in Alexander's approach to business, and generally conducted himself like someone who was there to learn rather than to network. The evenings. Final surprise came when Judge Cumberland approached our small group near the end of the reception. "Mrs. Thorne," he said formally, "I have one more announcement, if you'll indulge an old man's sense of theater." He guided Alexander and me back toward the main gathering, where he tapped his champagne glass to get everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Cumberland announced, "before we conclude this evening, I want to share one final piece of news. The Charleston Community Foundation has just received the largest single donation in its history, a gift that will establish a permanent endowment for sustainable development initiatives throughout the Lowcountry." Applause began, but the judge held up his hand. "This donation, which comes from Alexander and Sophia Thorne, will fund projects that balance economic growth with environmental protection, ensuring that Charleston's development serves as a model for other historic cities facing similar challenges." The applause this time was sustained and enthusiastic, but what moved me most was seeing Marcus clapping with genuine pride rather than the complicated mix of emotions that had characterized our family relationships for so long. As the reception wound down and guests began making their departures, Alexander and I found ourselves standing alone on the terrace where the evening had begun. The harbor was quiet now, just the distant sound of water against the seawall and the gentle rustle of Spanish moss in the evening breeze. "No regrets?" Alexander asked, taking my hand. I thought about the question seriously. 6 weeks ago, I'd been the family disappointment, married to a man my parents considered insufficient, living a life they saw as settling for less than I deserved. Tonight, I'd been celebrated by governors and judges, invited to help shape regional policy, and acknowledged as a community leader whose contributions would influence Charleston's development for generations. But more importantly, I'd finally understood that the family I'd been trying so hard to please had never been capable of seeing my actual worth. The validation I'd been seeking from them had been meaningless because it was based on their shallow understanding of success and their inability to recognize value that didn't fit their narrow categories. "No regrets," I said finally, "except maybe that it took me so long to realize that their approval was never worth having." Alexander smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he'd been waiting years for me to reach exactly that conclusion. "So what happens now?" he asked. I looked back through the windows at the reception hall, where the last few guests were making their final connections and exchanging business cards, where Judge Cumberland was discussing next month's economics. Development Council meeting, where Marcus was talking earnestly with Dr. Morrison about potential volunteer opportunities. "Now we build the life we actually want," I said. "Not the life anyone else thinks we should have, but the one that reflects our values and priorities and dreams." "And your family?" I considered the question. Marcus seems genuine about wanting a real relationship. My parents, I think they'll need to prove that they're capable of change before I'm willing to invest in repairing those relationships, and that might never happen. "You're okay with that?" "I'm more than okay with it," I said. "I spent 32 years trying to earn approval from people who were never going to give it to me for the right reasons. I'm done with that project." As we walked toward our car, I realized that the transformation was complete. I wasn't the family disappointment anymore. Not because my family had finally recognized my worth, but because I'd finally stopped needing them to. I'd found my community, my purpose, and my place in the world, and none of it required their validation or approval. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do when people try to diminish you is to simply outgrow their capacity to define you. Sometimes the best response to being called a disappointment is to build something so meaningful that their opinion becomes irrelevant. I didn't lose my family that night at Marcus's wedding. I found myself, And that turned out to be worth infinitely more than their approval had ever been. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.